Good morning, Lord. I think this vote is quite an interesting one, because whilst on the surface it is something quite straightforward, whether or not we believe that Mr Cannon is the right person to lead the government, I think the reality is far more complex. And many of you might have been expecting me to stand up and talk about my resignation in more depth, or to use that to build more of a case as to why Mr Cannon isn't the best man for the job, even perhaps expecting me to respond to his quite clearly planned attack on me in Tynwald earlier this month. But instead I'm going to talk a bit about confidence and a bit about competing philosophies, because that's really why we're here today. I'm also not going to talk about party politics, you'll be pleased to hear. I'm going to talk about the motion as worded, and actually I'm quite glad the Honourable Member for Arbury, Castletown and Maloo has worded it the way he has, because I don't think I could stand here and support a vote of no confidence in the Council of Ministers as a whole. And that's simply because when I look across the breadth of work that is going on in government, I can see that whether it's in DESC or DHA, infrastructure, enterprise, health, or DEFRA, or even, may my tongue turn black for saying this, even in the Treasury, there is a huge amount of really good stuff going on, led by ministers who I know are working incredibly hard and trying their best to move things in the right direction. And that's why the motion is more complex than I think Mrs Poole-Wilson or Mr Johnson have set out. It isn't as simple as saying the Chief Minister is the Council of Ministers, or the Chief Minister is the Island Plan. There are very real differences between views on these groups and plans, and it's entirely possible to support individual ministers or even a collective of ministers but not support the Island Plan. It's also possible to support the Island Plan but not every aspect within it. It's even possible to support an individual minister but not agree with everything they say or do. So to try and cast this debate as something it isn't is very much the definition of a dead cat strategy, and I applaud those members for giving it their best. The problem that ministers have is they're being held back from being able to make some of these difficult decisions that we all talk about, or being able to make some of what you might think of as bold decisions, largely because of opposition from the centre of government. And I've lost count of the number of times that proposals have come from one or other minister that have then been delayed or watered down following opposition from the centre of government. Now, sometimes it's decisions. Sometimes it's the publication of documents, plans or assessments that will help move things forward, but there's always a consistent factor. And so despite all this talk of delivery and getting things done, quite often one of the first and biggest stumbling blocks to government plans getting delivered is right at its heart. One quite straightforward example was explored briefly in questions this morning, and it's one of many. And that's really worrying to me, because, and this is where confidence comes in, it shows me that the Chief Minister doesn't really have confidence in the Island Plan. Now, the Island Plan basically boils down to three things: grow the economy, build homes, and deliver good quality infrastructure and services. That's it in a nutshell. Whichever way you cut it, those are the bedrock assumptions that underlie the aims of the plan. But those three things need investment. They need the ability to make difficult decisions and then stick with them, even when things get bumpy. And this is where I think the Honourable Member for Ayr and Michael falls down, because I've seen how these proposals, these difficult decisions, get brought to the Council of Ministers, get pushed back against, get watered down, or get pushed out into the long grass. There is far too much concern about the short-term impact, the public relations impact, not the long-term view, and that is entirely counterproductive when you place it in the context of the Island Plan, which does require a long-term view. Changing our population demographic isn't going to happen overnight or by accident. It will take a concerted effort. Changing course on the health service or in education or our border policy isn't going to happen overnight. It will take a concerted effort. And an even bigger problem comes when you look at funding some of this quite seismic change, because the Chief Minister has set out himself some very artificial restrictions on how we fund public services. Mr Ashford has said it. The elephant in the room is high demand and low tax. So we have to be willing to talk about that. We have to be willing to tackle it. And this is where political philosophies come in. I believe, like most sensible people, investing is how you generate a return, whether that's with your own business or an investment portfolio or at a government level. Sometimes it's about cash, straight up cash. Sometimes it's invest to save. Sometimes it's investment in services or IT or buildings or whatever it is to improve quality and effectiveness of those services. Now, public investment leads to society-wide benefits as well as economic growth. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, would agree with this. They state, there is a broad consensus in economics that public investment has a positive impact on economic growth and social welfare. Through the creation of physical capital, public investment makes it possible to deliver services essential to the mobility of persons, goods, and services. The Chief Minister, though, I don't believe thinks like this. He seems to follow the exact opposite philosophy, which would state that the best way to achieve economic growth is to shrink the state and pull back from services and reduce government expenditure. Essentially, the difference boils down to how you perceive risk and how you perceive expenditure. Do you perceive expenditure in education or in health or rehabilitation services or whatever it may be as spending or as an investment? Now, clearly there's a limit. Endless government spending is not something we should aspire to. But real terms reductions in expenditure has all sorts of negative consequences for the economy. And putting the bottom line as our ultimate goal is a very short-term outlook, as well as being very, very harmful. Now, you've seen this play out here and in the UK over the last maybe 10 to 15 years. Because that's been the philosophy that has largely been followed by successive governments on the island and across the water. Would anyone say they are better off now than they were 10 years ago? Or that services are better now than they were 10 years ago? Like Mr. Ashford, I've been out talking to a lot of people about these issues, and I can quite confidently say people really don't feel they're better off now than they were 10 years ago. If you feel differently, if you feel confident, yes, we're better off now than we were, by all means, vote to continue to support this philosophy that is being espoused, that is being quite clearly articulated. Our economic strategy, based on a very expensive piece of work the Chief Minister himself kicked off, talks about shifts in our economy, shifts in our tax base. And yet, every time this comes up for discussion, the Chief Minister ridicules. He shuts it down. And you've seen that only this month in his remarks to Tynwald. I cannot even begin to imagine how hard it has been for the Treasury Minister to operate in an environment where he knows his hands are tied even before he starts the day. So what we have, honourable members, is a council of ministers that has essentially been hamstrung by the Chief Minister, and this plays out in quite a lot of arenas. We've heard the legal position of the Chief Minister, and it's entirely correct to state he is the first amongst equals with very limited legal powers himself. But what's missing in that analysis is that overwhelmingly the job that we do is governed by unwritten rules, not the written ones. And the same goes for Council of Ministers. I do recall, for example, one case where the Chief Minister did lose a vote on one of those rare occasions that was voted 5-4, but the policy in question wasn't pursued by the department for a variety of reasons, all of which were quite sound. But it's not as straightforward as Mr. Ashford has laid out. It's not as straightforward as, well, you can outvote people. In practice, it doesn't really work like that. Now, Lorida, I know that members won't just take my word on some of this stuff. They'll want examples of the impact that this leadership approach causes. So I'm going to focus on something very recent in health. Now, I could have picked any number of items from pretty much any department, whether it's national insurance, drugs policy, transformation of education, planning reform, whatever. But this one is most recent and is most, I think, in the public consciousness right now. So last week, the Chief Minister circulated some information, including a list of health service cuts that were put on the table in front of the Council of Ministers a few weeks ago. Now, I need to be quite clear for members and for anyone listening, these were categorically not recommended or supported by Manx Care, who put this list together because they'd been very specifically asked to do so. I thought it would be useful to give a little bit more detail on the assessment of the impact of some of those cuts, because the document that was circulated was quite light on that. So I'll take just two examples. One because it was raised by the Honourable Member Miss Edge on the floor, and another because it really stuck in my mind. So the first item is the potential closure of meds, which Manx Care assess would result in a significant increase in waiting times and would undoubtedly cause patient harm due to excessive waits. Corridor care would be inevitable. Corridor care would be inevitable. The second item that stuck in my mind was the proposed closure of Ward 4. Manx Care believed closure would result in significant volumes of cancellation of planned inpatient admissions. A large proportion would be cancer, due to excessive numbers of medical overflow into surgical capacity. Delayed cancer treatment resulting in increased morbidity and increased complexity. I'm not going to go through the list in its entirety, honourable members, but you can see for yourself that nothing on it is good news. And practically everything on that list will result in some risk to patients, whether it's people being treated in corridors or increased morbidity. It's equally clear that a number of items on that list are not decisions Manx Care could make themselves, because the services in question, like meds, for example, are mandated. What this means is in order for that to stop, the department or council would have to change the mandate. And this is because if it was left up to Manx Care, given a choice between failing the mandate by coming in over budget and failing the mandate by failing to deliver a service, Manx Care, I believe, would choose the former over the latter. They would rather fail by coming in over budget than fail by harming patients. In essence, Manx Care would follow the logic that says investing in treating patients is in the long term the right thing to do, both medically and financially, as opposed to short-term service cuts that will have a significant longer-term impact, both to patients, impacts financially, and impacts to the island more broadly. So on seeing this list with these impacts, did the Chief Minister change course? He has publicly called a number of times for Manx Care to come in on budget, saying things like irrespective of demand, which itself is quite a dangerous policy position to take. But it actually seeing this list in black and white, that patients would suffer harm, have an effect on his position? And the answer is no. In fact, the Chief Minister has been quite clear as to his position, even knowing these potential outcomes. And you've heard it again from him this morning. His position has been made exceptionally clear. The budget matters more than these potential consequences. This is the position that he will no doubt be at some point asking Tynwald to support. And this is what I mean about confidence. We have an economic strategy, we have an island plan, we have a transformation programme, we have a housing and communities plan. All sorts of government strategies and plans. Now, all of these actually do align. And that is not an accident. These plans align because they are mostly evidence-based. And the evidence all points towards similar outcomes and similar aims. So if you have confidence in these plans, if you follow the evidence, you stay the course. You can't pick and choose the bits that you like, because the information and the evidence base all points in that same direction, and all of those plans are heavily interlinked. Yes, new information will probably result in tweaks and changes to those plans, but you don't try and throw the whole plan overboard when things get difficult. And this is hugely problematic, because, as Mr. Callister highlighted in his remarks, the Chief Minister simply doesn't listen to others. And this is quite clearly evident to many. When the reality of these government plans run up against the Chief Minister's personal philosophies, the actions in these plans are inevitably delayed or watered down, or in some cases simply ignored. In short then, how can the Chief Minister ask us to have confidence in him when it looks like he doesn't have confidence in his own plans? Mr. Speaker, we had a debate in Tynwald this month where you talked eloquently about being careful to identify the root cause of the problem and to focus your efforts on fixing that. So following in that vein, I'm not going to stand here and ask members to think about Comyn as a whole. I think the Honourable Member for Albury Castleton and Malou has perhaps accidentally or maybe deliberately got it quite right when he worded this motion. The problem is right at the centre, and I would ask you to very carefully consider that issue, not the wider issue that has been thrown on the table in terms of confidence in the plan or in the Council of Ministers. And that's because, for me, I don't see this as being about changing the direction of the island plan. I think I agree with everything that's been said about stability and continuity and it being too late to change course. And actually, there's a lot of sensible commentary there. I believe the plan we have is, broadly speaking, the right plan. I know not everyone will agree, but I think it is. My concern is I don't think that plan will be delivered under this Chief Minister's leadership. That's my worry. I'm not saying it's the wrong plan. I'm not saying we should throw it out. What I'm saying is actually you want people who are committed to delivering that plan. And I honestly believe that most of the Council of Ministers are absolutely committed to delivering that plan. So what would change? What would change, I think, is you would see promises kept and plans adhered to. Tynwald said they're going to do a thing, but they do a thing. That's pretty much what it boils down to. And I'll leave you with a final thought, honourable members. The Chief Minister is looking around for a new Minister for Health, likely a person who will be tasked with implementing these service cuts that I've touched on. Now, if you say today that you do have confidence in the Chief Minister, you must have confidence in his approach and the potential consequences of it. Because that's really what you're being asked to support today. And if you do have confidence in that approach, you do support and have confidence in those potential outcomes and saying that's okay, surely you'd be willing to serve as the next Minister for Health. Mr. Ashford said, if you keep going the way you're going, you'll eventually run out of people to be ministers. Are we at that stage? Have we actually run out of people willing to put their hands up and say, I'll be the Minister for Health, don't worry about it? I mean, I resigned 2 weeks ago. I've not seen lots of people running to the radio to say they'd happily take on that job. So to members like Mr. Wannenberg who talk about stepping up to the plate and taking responsibility, it would be quite strange, I think, to stand up today and vote to support the Chief Minister to say you have confidence in his leadership, but then not be willing to work for him in the Council of Ministers. And so, like the Honourable Member for Douglas North, I do think having this debate and vote is very helpful because it cuts through the noise. It cuts through what people say and lets us be judged on our actions, not just on our words, because it forces us to cast a vote. And our votes are not secret, so we can be held accountable by our constituents for those votes. It's pretty straightforward. And as we've heard so much today about pulling together, and even the word mutiny, I think, was used by one member, I will leave you this thought from Terry Pratchett. Pulling together is the aim of despotism and tyranny. Free men pull in all kinds of directions. It's the only way to make progress. Guru Mayu, Lord.